and welcome to the Disability Education and Society podcast. This is a podcast for collective learning and unlearning in the struggle for intersectional liberation. We focus on educational realms, expanding to other societal areas. We share our stories as academics as well as those of our featured guests, including disability activists involved with multifaceted dimensions of systems equity, self-determination efforts, anti-ableist, and anti-racist liberation. Join us as co-conspirators.
Dr. Chantal Figueroa is a researcher, educator, and strategist that specializes in designing evidence-based programs meant to support the mental health and well-being of Latine peoples. Dr. Figueroa is the co-editor of the book titled Disability in the Americas, the intersection of education, power, and identity.
Thank you all so much for being here today. We have a wonderful guest. I'm super excited to have Dr. Chantal Figueroa join us here today for a really interesting conversation. And so I'm going to just go right ahead and begin with our first question. So welcome, Dr. Figueroa. And we, again, so thrilled to have you here today. And we would like to start by having you share a personal story related to your interest in disability.
Well, thank you so much for having me and for having an interest in my research. Yeah, so I started researching the psychiatric system of Guatemala since 2012. After some family members had interactions with the psychiatric system of Guatemala, and me realizing how cruel the system was, and really becoming curious as to why it was like that. So that was the door that opened what is now has been my research agenda on understanding what does mental health mean for people in Guatemala, and now more broadly, what does mental health mean for people who come from a country that has had war. So that's how I got to that research agenda.
Gracias. I'm gonna use your first name if it's okay, Chantal.
Yeah, that's fine.
I want to jump to our next question. That is actually a question that links mental health and decoloniality, but I'm gonna start by sharing a story of mine that I have never shared in public. So I'm sharing it to the global audience that follows this program, and I've never written about this. And the reason I'm telling this story is because I'm convinced that there is a very thin wall that divides psychiatric establishments and schooling, institutionalized structures, especially if you go to a boarding school like I did. I went to a boarding school when I was 4, and I was separated from my mother. I grew up with a single mother. So separated from my family from the age of 4 till I was 10 or so. But the first part of this boarding school was kind of an informal, what you would call here a nonprofit. It was a sort of grassroots attempt to serve very poor blind folks. If I had tried to go to another boarding school, I couldn't have gone because they demanded uniforms and a bunch of things that my family couldn't afford. So we were separated by gender. The male students were in the sort of backyard, sort of this patio. It was an old house, but these sort of colonial houses. I don't know how old it was, but it was made of bareque is how they call it. It's how do you call it? Adobe type of houses, the kind of houses you would find in New Mexico or Santa Fe, in some of those places. Um, Thick walls. I don't. It's hard for me to describe it unless you guys are familiar with these adobe houses that are old. So we were in San Cristobal, which is in the Andean region, is not as cold as here, but it got cold at night, and we would have to essentially endure that because of that separation. Girls were inside the house, but because I got in so small, I sometimes get the privilege of watching soap operas with the woman who guarded the place. But I was a very slow eater. When I was eating, um, I think the it exasperated this woman, and I was beaten by her to quote unquote make me eat faster. I think I'm still now a very slow eater just because of I guess my sense of resistance to that kind of disciplinary process. Eventually, they closed that house, that particular version of the boarding school, and Venezuela got sort of this oil money once they nationalized oil, and there was resources to rent much better housing and get many teachers, etc. But that something that stuck with me as an experience of the cruelty, uh, perhaps at a minor level, but still, um, cruelty that's not anything you deserve. It's not like you go to prison because you committed a crime or something. It's institutionalization that comes simply because you have disabilities.
Mhm.
And I want to use that story to connect the conversation um, between mental health and decoloniality in schools
Mhm.
within the American context. Um, Yesterday, as we were recording this, there was another mass shooting in the state of Wisconsin, in Madison, and it's a Christian school. Ironically, it's called Abundant Life Christian School. Um, and the shooter was a girl, 17-year-old, um, who also died. And it's, I mean, the whole thing is already probably even worse than a boarding school in the sense that it creates this anxiety for parents and kids not knowing if they can be alive when they come out. And then you add to this issues of mass deportation that is supposed to be coming up with the threat that um, kids born here in the States will also be deported with their parents. Um, how do you see, Chantal, this conflation of events for, first of all, schools as spaces of oppression, but also as decoloniality, sort of transgressivity, the sort of transgressive creativity that could come up um, through teachers, through school counselors, through school psychologists, through I don't know, um, perhaps parent movements. How do you see this um, moment in terms of um, repression slash decoloniality as far as mental health is concerned in schooling?
Mhm. Well, first, thank you for sharing that story. I think that you exemplify a little bit of what my work highlights, which is that policies that involve traumatizing children and their families, specifically Latinx, have been the tool of oppression for centuries. It is a very efficient way to oppress. It's a very cost-effective way to oppress, and it's one that lasts generations, and that in and of itself is a pedagogy, right? And so in my work, I really ask, what is mental health? Because we are ruled by a definition of mental health, whether we know it or not. And so as a critical pedagogue that I consider myself as a professor, I see in education that kind of Freudian hope of awareness, right? Of becoming aware, critically aware of the systems of oppression. And I think that is so important in mental health, because trauma has been used and considers and continues to be used onto brown, Black, Indigenous people, queer people, as a tool of oppression, right? There's this great psychologist, Dr. I don't know if they are a doctor, but called Prentice Hemphill, who defines oppression as the targeting of trauma onto a specific population, right? That is their definition of oppression, and one that rings true to what I do and study. And so in that story, for example, of separating a 4-year-old from their family, we see those policies being articulated in different contexts, but with the same process, at the border, in immigration, in deportation, right? Deportation is also a placement of trauma onto a family, specifically in a culture where familiarismo, right? Or this families can be a place of mental health, of resilience, right? So to break that up is on purpose, and it is an implementation of trauma, right? Of now having these transnational families, or being under the threat of becoming one. So I think that the inflicting trauma onto Latinx people specifically is one of the particularities of how we become Latinos, Latine, Latinx, right? Is through, it's almost like that's what makes us Latino. It's being in relationship, how to say this? Being a people that receive trauma in that we call policies, that we call immigration, that we call, policing, security. So that's one. So I think that's one point about separating children from their families. The other point about school violence, I think that I really love the work by, and now their name escapes me, but Leonardo. I will send you the name because now I don't remember, but they wrote this paper on smartness as property, and this understanding that rationality, that being smart is a category of exclusion, right? That what makes us smart in a classroom, for example, is that there are people that were told, no, you cannot come into this space. And so as this...
It's Leonardo and Broderick.
Can you tell me?
They co-wrote that piece. I think came out in the teacher
Zeus
college.
Leonardo, right?
Yeah,
Yes,
Leonardo and
Zeus is the
Broderick.
first
Yeah.
name, and Elise
Um,
Broderick. Yeah.
Yeah. So
yeah, smartness becomes a property as a way to almost justify the oppression of whoever doesn't seem to be smart. So
right,
within
to
a group.
naturalize exclusion, right? To justify, to naturalize exclusion. So I think we have to be critical of schools as perpetrators of systems of oppression, in which then the only way to relate is through violence, because that is the system that is being reproduced, versus learning or critical learning, critical thinking, which I think to me is one of the core need or one of the core things we need to have mental health. Like one aspect of mental health is to have an awareness, a critical awareness of how we relate to our history, to our institutions, to ourselves, to the people around us. And this is a definition that I take from Martín Baró, who defined mental health from a Central American perspective as the relationship we have with history, governments, ourselves, and others, right? So mental health as relational. So from that definition, I believe that critical awareness is a very important, plays a very important role. I don't know if schools, right, or the formal education system is the place to find. I hope as an educator, but we also have to be critical of schools as spaces of that naturalize oppressive systems.
Hmm. What I see different this time, because Obama and uh, the prior Trump administration deported massively huge amounts of kids. Many of them were placed in these cages. Um, there were a lot of sort of spectacles to create fear on purpose, as you talked about the targeting of trauma was so evident in the way it worked. But there was also an obvious sense of resilience
Yes.
in the way kids. I remember doing advocacy for um, kids that didn't have any parents here, but they had some kind of not even family member, but somebody who had been given power of attorney to take care. And in some cases, they even had the ability to self-advocate these youth in high school, um, surviving, and some of them became dreamers and sort of somehow got to college or got to work because part of the dream of many of these people is just to preserve um, their kids from the maras or from whatever killing mechanism is over there. So parents do these sacrifices of getting minors with coyotes and all that stuff to get them here. Now, the promise of deporting American citizens, which would take us back to the 1930s during the Great Depression, there were massive deportations of mostly Mexican American citizens. And so we would be going back a century in terms of I think that's quite different. And the other thing that's also different is the fracturing of Latinx communities, because a lot of Latinx people voted for this, knowing that there was going to be mass deportation. So they felt we're here, and we don't care if they're going to be deporting these others that are not like us for whatever reason. So it's also fracturing the relational wherewithal of the community, the Latinx communities that in prior versions of this were more attuned to some kind of form of solidarity. Um, so how do you think the the work of champions, communal champions, perhaps educators, as I said, school counselors, people who can play the championing role, how they can help um, revitalize some of these linkages, some of this sense of awareness with one's own history and one's own sense of community, which is what has kept resilience alive in Latinx communities.
I say that the most important is to think of issues historically to realize that this is not an exception, but is a pattern that is repeating itself over and over. Teach from a place of historical knowledge, of also of resistance, right? Of the fact that, indigenous people, queer people have always been persecuted, and yet here we are. So also as a history of tactics of resistance, of resilience, I think right now we're in a moment where psychologists and educators are having a decolonial lens and are asking themselves how to not perpetuate white supremacy through an individual frame of mental health, one that just wants us to be productive and serve capitalism, but rather to deconstruct what we consider to be sane, to be natural, to be normal, and to center ancestral knowledge, right? And really fight against this idea that we don't have the solution, that the solution is in the future and we haven't reached it, and instead consider that the solution already and has already always existed. There are other paradigms, or there are paradigms of the global majority that have been protected, and in which we don't have to, where this violence is not justified, if that makes sense. So for me, I think we already have the tools to resist this threat of mass deportation, because this has already happened. It's a pattern. Let's go to Arizona, to all folks there. They will tell us and teach us how to resist better, for example. But I would say from this critical mental health awareness, or this Martin Baró perspective, it would be to think historically, to think communally, right, in the community, and to really resist how perversive white supremacy and capitalism adapts to the current discourse, not to get convinced by woke language, but rather by the process, but also the goal, right? The goal is emancipation. The goal is a change of system. It's not for an individual to better fit into what already exists. So that's why in my work, I just repeat the same thing, which is we need to know what definition of mental health we are working under and towards, and that clarity gives us the pedagogical tools to support the skills needed, which are critical thinking, historical thinking, how to work in groups, communally, how to understand knowledge as co-created, right? How to resist all of those colonial narratives of being the first one to discover this one concept, but rather realize that we are all learning together communally. So focusing on the relationships, how do we relate, if that makes sense, if I can answer your question.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really think that's a very powerful way to approach the issues.
Yeah, I really like what you said about the idea of like the solution already exists. As someone who I work in teacher education, and I often get the questions about like, okay, so what do we do? I mean, and so this like, what do we do Monday morning, right? In to think about how we can lean on the people who are impacted the most and how they have resisted and learn from them. I think this relational aspect that you mentioned is so powerful. And I think our folks who engage with the podcast can really learn a lot from that sort of approach. I do want to take us back a bit to Guatemala, because I think that in from the U.S. perspective, having taught in the U.S., I think here in the U.S. we have a very distorted and very ignorant understanding of what you mentioned, the history, right? And so we think about the borders and like, why are people coming here, right? And kind of blaming that on the individuals coming here, but without realizing the history of like how the U.S. has, in fact, made it so, right, that folks have to come here because of the role of the U.S. empire. So I just wanted to have you share a little bit about the history of Guatemala for yes, for me, and for others who have a very again just lack of knowledge, right, of the context of Guatemala in the relationship with the U.S. and in this immigration sort of crisis, if you will, that it's being parroted by the U.S. media and politicians here.
Yeah. Let's see, I'm trying to from where to start. I think first I would like to just push back a little bit against this idea that it's the history of and I'll get to the history of the Civil War in Guatemala that has brought on an immigration crisis. I believe that immigration is a human right and people have always been traveling, and that it's borders that are just lines of violence. So just kind of this caveat, right? That I think that we have always been traveling around the planet. But yeah, so Guatemala is a very interesting country to know its history, because it teaches us a lot about violence and racism and class and almost classism, castes, This fall, 2024, Guatemala is commemorating the 500 years since the Spanish invasion. So I think that is one of the first things that we need to know, is that when the Spanish crown colonized Latin America, Guatemala was the center of the colonizers. Central America was one territory, and Guatemala was the political power. So it had a very strong connection to Spain, to the crown. And that's very important because it has kind of informed the legacy of Guatemala today. And so there's this really great anthropologist, Marta Casao Zarzu, who did the family trees of the oligarchy in Guatemala and concluded that she couldn't unearth or distinguish between the moment that Guatemala became a country and the creation and the importation of racism, that it was one and the same, because the Guatemalan state is a Spanish crown imagination, and it is meant for people of Spanish descent. So those racial politics in Guatemala were already based on segregation. So Guatemala as a country was a segregation between those who were considered as close as Spanish as possible, and the others who were Mayan mostly, but also Afro-Guatemalans. And so that is kind of the context in which Guatemala becomes a republic in like 1890. And those tensions are going to come to a breaking point, or another breaking point, in the early 1930s, because Guatemala, after a series of revolutions, is choosing socialist governments, socialist governments that are coming to nationalize lands owned by companies in the US. Specifically in the 1930s, 1950s, it's Chiquita Banana, who owns a large majority of land that produces bananas and is paying very little for the labor and is not paying taxes on those bananas. And so the socialist president, Arbenz, comes and says, no, we're going to like a US company cannot own Guatemalan land, nationalizes it, and that triggers kind of like a communism panic, or that is we are kind of entering Cold War. That's the fear from the US. And so Guatemala is one of the first countries to have a US backed up military coup in the 1950s to dethrone this socialist president under this idea of communism, right? Communism alert. And so a democratically elected president is dethroned. And so Guatemala now has a series of military dictatorships that are really just puppets to the US economic interests. And so specifically, we note the presidency of Efraín Ríos Montt, who was an evangelist, I don't know if this is true, but he was Protestant and a military dictator who took these already kind of this context, I told you, racial context of Guatemala, and used sorry, because in the 1950s, so Guatemala, to resist the military coups, there is an elite of Guatemala city people that come together to resist the military, and they become a guerrilla. And so Efraín Ríos Montt uses this excuse of fighting the guerrilla to commit what will become a genocide of Mayan people, specifically Ixchil Mayan, because Guatemala has 26 different ethnicities, and uses what we now know are actually weapons of displacement that are being used in Palestine right now, for example, of politics of scorched earth, of pinning civilians against civilians. So what is peculiar about the civil war in Guatemala that lasted 36 years from 1954 to 1996 was that the government used psychological and gender violence as a weapon of war. And that now, as I said, are weapons that are used when you are displacing a people and when you are committing genocide. And genocide is the killing of a way of knowing, right, of a paradigm that happens through the separation of children from their parents, for example, through forced adoptions, the persecution of women. And so in Guatemala, there has been that war led to a genocide of Ixchil people. And so Guatemala becomes then a laboratory to understand colonial violence, but also imperial violence, but also everyday violence, but also at the same time resistance and healing, right? Because people are still thriving, right? They're still having joy and birthday parties, even though there's a lot of violence. But so I don't know if I made sense in this kind of trying to summarize very complex history, but it's important to note that Guatemala was this colonial regime, like center, and that this racism against Mayan people culminated in a genocide. And that today Guatemala continues to be a very racist country where violence has been naturalized and normalized. And so in my work, I follow the great work of Cecilia Menjivar, who creates this concept of multi-sided violence to account for the specific violences that Guatemalan women face, which is a routine violence every day and in different places, from different places at the same time. So Guatemala is a great place to learn about how violence gets naturalized through education, but also how people resist and heal from so many layers of violence.
And for English readers, that work of Cecilia Menjivar is very, very valuable for contemporary stuff. There is also a good translation of The Open Veins of Latin America, which some people may have read, but some of our listeners, viewers, can read that book to understand how the Spanish empire really worked. Andrea Gunderfrandt, who was a Uruguayan dependency theorist, wrote a lot about how there is more dependency, particularly in those places that were the centers of power in the Spanish Empire, Mexico, um, the Cuban place, the Guatemala in what Chantal is describing, Lima in South America. So you see how Buenos Aires, how these um, virreinatos or these places where the bulk of the imperial uh, expeditions spread from, they now in towards the 21st century become the most dependent of all the places in Latin America in terms of the extraction that they experienced and how that left the countries crippled to actually, after independence, quote unquote, have a sense of development that could be less tied to imperialistic structures. I think you did a wonderful job, Chantal, of um, um, describing what happens in Guatemala. One thing that I want to underscore is that there was a UN sponsored, quote unquote, peace process that took place in the 90s in Guatemala. And Guatemala and Salvador were the only two places in Latin America, I mean, in Central America, where that has crystallized. Um, Colombia is the only place in South America where that has formalized. And each of those processes seem to be quite different. I think each of them exemplifies a lot of things, but I think the core thing about Guatemala is what Chantal described, how this early resistance popped up, and there was an interest in the American empire to destroy that resistance as soon as possible. And by the way, the most recent elections in Guatemala resulted in the election of this new movement, which is perceived as progressive, the Semilla movement. Still early to know exactly how that's going to crystallize, but that's an interesting space of hope and showing how people still in Guatemala want to resist a lot of these right-wing things that are happening in other parts of Central America, like what's happening in El Salvador with all these repressive right-wing regimes or other things. So it's an interesting, I mean, Guatemala is definitely a great microcosm to understand dynamics of resistance and violence for Latin America.
Yeah, thank you for that, Chantal. I thought you did a really clear and concise and so connected summary of the history. And as someone who had schooling here in the US, I feel like that's what I learned in the last few minutes far outweighed what I learned over the last 40 years, right, of education here in the US, which is saying a lot, right, about the knowledge that is not available for many of us here in our education system. That we are, like I mentioned, very ignorant about issues beyond the borders. And I also want to thank you for clarifying about that people have always migrated, and that's part of humans, right? That's what we do. We move around, and it's made it legal, like you mentioned, that the borders we established, the policy we established, and so that is also important. That's and so thank you for that. I do want to talk about, something that I really thought it was very clear what you mentioned earlier about this idea of like trauma is used as a tool of oppression, as a weapon of war. And I really thought about this other aspect about we talk a lot about this notion of disablement, right? And so I was wondering about your thoughts about that. Like trauma is for me, right? Like here again, I'm talking a lot about the U.S. context, right? Like educators, right, counselors here are takes trauma very seriously, but it is also very discriminatory, right? Like trauma for white people is taken seriously, whereas traumas for everybody else is not seen as that. So, yeah, I just wanted to have you talk a little bit about this idea of trauma and disablement, how you see those two kind of working, or how do you see those kind of two concepts working together?
Yeah, thank you. So what I actually have concluded in my research is that in Guatemala, where gender and psychological violence have been used to oppress the population and silence the political resistance, you find a psychiatric system that is very criminalizing as well. So for me, it's part of the same mechanism of oppression, is to torture those who then require services, So through that lens, through being able to see that trauma as a weapon is the implementation of trauma. It's like giving trauma to a population, but it's also not giving services to heal, right? It's an omission, right? It's an action and it's an omission. Similarly, I find that it's it's such a it's such a productive tool, because when, for example, and trigger warning, I'm going to describe violence, but for example, when you see Black men or trans women being killed in the hands of the police, that is a reminder to all Black people or all trans people that their humanity is not respected, right? And so that is a mechanism of trauma. So it can be, it can be a direct action to loss of life, and it can be a lack of services of understanding. And so, for example, in Central America, the definition of mental health that we use by Martin Baró, which is a definition that has to be relational, historical, political, was developed by Martin Baró, and he was murdered by the CIA. And his murder was coined a Sophiacide, the killing of knowledge, right? So when you were talking to me about, I didn't know that about Guatemala, that's on purpose, right? It's a Sophiacide, the killing of knowledge. And so to persecute somebody who had created a definition of mental health that was historical, communal, and it was not linked to individual productivity, right? Tells you something about the power of acknowledging or understanding that oppression is psychological, it's emotional, right? That trauma is used because it disables in not the normative way, but it takes away the values that we consider to be sane. For example, sanity, as we define it in the West, right, is linked to a person understanding themselves as an individual, as independent from others. And a big critique there is that people of color or women don't have that ability to think of themselves as just one person. We think of ourselves as related to others, right? Another value of sanity is understanding time as a linear and always progressing into the future, and trauma changes how we relate to time, right? So that is a maddening, if you want to say, right? In a system where if you are not sane, cruelty will be done unto you in the form of care, right? In that reality, to take away our sense of linearity of time, right? Or to change our understanding of who we are in relationship to our community is to take away capital, and it's to disable in that way, right? To become more precarious.
There's
And
something you said here that it really struck me when you talk about Sophia side versus a lot of people use the word epistemicide to mean the same thing,
yeah,
but I catch the power of talking about Sophia side because Sophia is perceived to be a female um, component. In Spanish, the word sabiduría is female. Sophia is perceived in the Eastern cultures as a female component, and it makes me think of feminicides and
yeah,
the power of killing femaleness, killing women
mhm,
as a very, very accentuated component of the strategy of trauma creation in a collective way, which is what you're describing. It's not just this my trauma or somebody's trauma is every subaltern group's trauma multiplied through the killing of Sophia. The killing is not merely an epistemicide. in the sense of thinking of knowledge as this male epistemic thing, but it's a more female character. So I find that, and I will start copying that idea of thinking of Sophia side as
I
opposed to.
wish I remember the reference because it's not me, it's somebody who wrote about Martín Baró who called it a Sophia side.
Interesting. Because Santos and a lot of people prefer to talk about epistemicides.
Yeah.
But in truth, talking about Sophia side changes the conversation in ways that to me are very um, connected to what really happens in Guatemala specifically, happens a lot in Mexico and Juarez, all these decades of epistemicide that goes with full impunity. It's not just a symbolic thing. It's a real way of killing Sophia through the killing of women as well, especially women of color, right?
Yeah, which is a arm of genocide.
Hmm. Right.
I love the way that you have made these connections and shown us these interconnections of uh, you know, you talk about Sophia-cide, epistemicide, right? Things that are happening in Palestine, how Guatemala was the central part of that, how the U.S. is connected. I mean, all these things are so interconnected, and I think that really helps me, the audience here, really learn more about the work that you do. And I just wanted to also um, kind of bounce this idea back because I feel like it's so important because you mentioned of like the trauma, mental health, right? That it here again in the US, it tends to be very much focused on the individual. And so I just want to highlight that part. What I hear you saying is that you think about and you focus on trauma as this very communal, relational sort of conception, right, if you will, yeah, I just want have you kind of talk more about that because emphasize that point because when we talk about trauma, like here, like we say, okay, this is what's going on with you. You've gone through some trauma. Let's and you mentioned care, right? As the care that then we provide as an additional source of a tool of oppression, if you will, right? Like, okay, now that you have this trauma, the mental health issue that we think you have, right? This is what we're going to do to care for you. So, yeah, I just wanted to
Yeah.
kind of talk more about that.
Yeah, so what I've learned in my teaching and research is that there are multiple ways to conceptualize mental health and mental illness, and that we need to get to the value systems and the definition that we are working under. So, for example, in the West, right, mental illnesses were developed in the 19th century with the creation of the asylum, where people who were considered morally inferior would be sent away in order to protect the morality of the sane people, right? And so by putting people in an enclosure, then the doctors in those institutions could create a list of symptoms, and that was the first time that kind of psychiatry started becoming a field, was with these list of symptoms that were observed in these enclosed space, right? And that was how the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, right, kind of where it has its roots. So it's really important to highlight that mental illness in the West is a series of symptoms, okay? This is very important because there are other epistemologies, like for example, in the Mayan, in the cosmovision, where mental illness is a cause. It doesn't matter the symptoms, it's the cause that we are looking for to cure. But in the West, it's the symptoms, right? And this creates a very kind of philosophical problem, right? Because as we know, symptoms are cultural specific. They're maybe even temporal, right? They depend on interpretation, and of course, as scientific racism was a thing during that time, right? One of the first mental illnesses was hysteria, which was given to women, right, who were believed to have a uterus to be like a butterfly, and the uterus would kind of travel around their body and land in their mind, in their brain, and they would become hysterical, right? So there was also another mental illness called drapetomania, which was considered when enslaved people broke free from their enslavement, they were diagnosed as running away from home, right? So we have to understand the
Wow.
political, historical uh, uh, where mental health and mental illness comes from, right? So in the West, then, right, to be mentally healthy is to have a symptomatology that is aligned with white male middle class values. So, for example, in the DSM-4, if you read it, one of the symptoms is to worry about your financial security, right? That is a
That's
middle
a joke.
class
Yeah.
value, right? Right. So it's important to note then that we are under a definition of mental health that is about being an individual who is productive, who is rational, who is moderate, and that these values come from a very WASP, right, worldview. And so that from that perspective, oppression can become depoliticized because we just want the individual to go to therapy, to take a rest, to buy a face mask in order to either buy a product, right, or to rest so that they can be more productive tomorrow. It's not about breaking down the systems that make us into machines and think of humans as non-disabled, like as like, forever 21, that's the definition of humanity. It's not the definition of we all grow old, we will all become disabled at some point in our lives if we are lucky enough. So that's why I always repeat myself. It's important to know the value system under which we are functioning, but also under which we are teaching, right? Or providing therapy. What is the political goal? Is it for you to become productive and accept and continue? Or is it for you to learn how to collaborate and dismantle and dream differently and desire differently, right? And with my students, I just make this very simple task where I don't give them work for one day. They have no readings, they have no homework. And what I observe is that most of them have panic attacks. They don't know how to be, they don't know the difference between being and doing. This is a question I get asked, but professor, what is the difference between being and doing, right? And so we are under a mental health model that doesn't want us to see that difference, that it's one and the same. So coming back, sorry, it's really long, but coming back to your question, there are other paradigms in which a communal mental health is also a relationship with land, right? Like, is it that we are anxious, or is it that there is no oxygen in the planet, right? Or like the icebergs are melting. Maybe our spirit can feel it. How few trees are in the world. Is it anxiety, or is it existential dread? So there are paradigms that push against, that politicize this, or push against the lie that we are individuals, because it's a lie, but those paradigms are persecuted. Therefore, Sophia side, they are actively persecuted.
Wow.
Wow,
It sounds like we could spend the whole night just going through this. This is so powerful.
amazing.
I wish I could just kind of squeeze more of your brain to keep hearing. I guess we say brain as another um way of Sophia's side, because obviously the location of reason and the brain and whatever is another problem, eliminating the holistic nature of Sophia as a way of cultivating gnosis, cultivating knowledge that's more connected to being than connected to doing.
Mhm,
Um, yeah, I was thinking of Nelson Maldonado Torres, who
mhm,
talks about the coloniality of being um, through a sort of philosophical lens. And just listening to you, I can see how this issue of coloniality of being connects directly to both disablement and um, trauma and false constructions of mental health and so on and so forth.
mhm.
That, yeah, I absolutely loved the, being here in the space with you, learning from you, and taking away this what you shared about what you do in your class and not assigning anything, because for me, if that was to happen, I would think that the students would be really appreciative. But when you mentioned they were panicking, that is also something I didn't think about that could happen. But yeah, it's we taking more time than we agreed to of your time here, Chantel. I know you have so much going on, but we so deeply appreciate you spending some time with us, sharing a lot of great thoughts and ideas. And I know that I will take away. I'll be listening to this podcast several times or many times to just kind of recapture so many great things. And I know the audience of our podcast will do the same as well. So as we close, if folks want to learn more about the work that you're doing, can you share a little bit about how they could connect with you or find out more? Because our time here was just the beginning, right, of the many great things that you're doing.
Yes, thank you. Yes, you can follow me on Instagram at Chantal Figueroa, Ph.D. You can email me at cfigueroa@coloradocollege.edu. Yeah, just put my name on Google. I have a website that I haven't updated in many years, but I'm sure you can also contact me through there. Yeah, it would be great to know how this is received. And thank you so much for letting me talk about my research and for your interest in learning more. It's always delightful to know that what you study is interesting outside of your of yourself. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you, Chantel. We again are so appreciative of you and the work that you do and all that you've offered here in our conversation today. Uh, so,
Gracias, Chantal.
Gracias, Alexis. Bye.
Salud. Chao.
yeah, that was a amazing conversation. What are your thoughts, Alexis, as we had this opportunity to converse with Chantel?
Yeah, I wanted to bring home this idea of care as control because to me, I think it could help us expand some of the authentic caring conversation we had initiated in a writing, engaging with Rectorate and back in 2018. You got me familiarized with her work um, and how that can translate into, if when we were talking about assessment, for instance, having a caring purpose or so some of the things we have been thinking about could be deepened tremendously if we start thinking about this idea of targeted trauma, disablement, how care can be used to control even more the people who had been diagnosed. So diagnosis becomes almost like an entry point, but then comes the real hammer, right?
Mm.
Through the care, through the quote unquote services that you're supposed to be receiving. They're really meant to deepen the control as opposed to heal or give you any of these relational aspects that Chantal was underlying today. That
Yeah,
don't you think?
I thought it was just such a powerful conversation, and we are doing this debrief because I think it just overall it just enhanced the podcast experience for folks who engage with this podcast. I'm going to just quickly uh, shout out the folks that I learned this from, which is Teddy and Sherry. They have a podcast with Totals, which is a Math for All podcast. So I just learned that from them and just thought that we could apply that here. And so yeah, back to Chantel. I just and what you were sharing. I really thought a lot about special education here in the US, thought about the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistics Manual, in which in many cases I see it as people view that as sort of the Bible, right,
Yeah,
of
yeah.
mental health, of disability diagnosis. As hey, that's to go the to go to place to get the diagnostic, and then
Yeah, and
after.
it helps to dehumanize because then you don't look at the person, you look at the symptoms of the disability. So you say, oh, autism means that such and such is gonna do such and such, and they already preempt your uniqueness through the DSM symptoms of
Mm,
whatever you are supposed to have, right?
yeah,
So
and I
you're
like how
nonverbal. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
yeah, I like how Chantel mentioned like the West focus on the symptoms, while like the Mayans, for example, the paradigm the Mayans is focusing on the cause, right? And how different that is in thinking about like the DSM. Like it's all about the symptoms, and then as you mentioned, as Chantel mentioned, then the care. I really like how you put that as the hammer, right? Like after we diagnose you, here comes the hammer, right? And so that is I feel such a powerful way to phrase it.
And they sell it as services. They are sell it as, oh, if we don't diagnose you, then we cannot give you services. We cannot give you care.
Mm.
When in fact, it's a trap. You're just getting at the door of hell and you don't know it, you know?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Just yeah. So many great things that came out of the conversation for the both of us. I know I speak for myself, and I think it will apply for our audience in the Disability Education and Society podcast. So thank you,
Yeah.
Alexis.
Sure. I just want to add something for the audience. I think this mass deportation experience is going to be one that will require a communal response from a lot of folks in education and beyond. So I think um, the deepening our conceptual engagement and finding ways to make that actionable is going to be crucial. And I don't know the answers to those things, but I think it's a seed that I want to leave um, with folks in fertile soil, and hopefully they will let it germinate and transform into collective initiatives that are going to help resist and find ways to heal people through that journey that's about to become evident for everybody.